Now that we have some understanding of how to measure inequality, we know enough to explore some patterns or changes in inequality in the U.S. over time. It will quickly become apparent that what we say about how inequality has changed in the U.S. over certain periods in the past can be sensitive to the specific inequality measure that we use. Discussions of inequality in the United States gained renewed national prominence around 2007-2008, thanks largely to the major recession and to the Occupy protest movement. Those discussions tended to focus on changes in inequality within this century and also tended to focus on changes in inequality at the very top of the distribution. However, since the 1980s in the U.S., there have been major changes in inequality throughout the income distribution. One remarkable feature of the rise in inequality in the U.S. over this period is that it was extremely broad-based. By this I mean that there were major increases in both across-group inequality, so that highly educated individuals had incomes that grew faster than those with less education, and increases in within-group inequality. This latter fact means that, even among those with a specific level of education, inequality, those differences among people at different points of the distribution, grew substantially. Here's a glimpse of the trend in the Gini coefficient, the summary measure of inequality we discussed in an earlier module, for the U.S. and for a few other countries from 1970 to the mid-2000s. Recall that the higher the Gini coefficient, the more inequality a country is experiencing. For the U.S., this shows an increase in inequality beginning in the 1980s and continuing through to the mid-2000s. This shows that something was changing about inequality in the U.S. and other countries beginning several decades ago. Using some other measures based on various income and earnings percentiles, we can fill in even more of this story. This graph shows the trend in wage inequality in the U.S. as measured by the 90-10 ratio for all men and separately for all women. The lines go up over time, indicating a higher ratio of the 90th percentile of wages to the 10th percentile of wages with each passing year. The trend was similar for men and women. What, though, does it mean that the line for men, the red line, lies above the line for women at all times? This simply means that the level of wage inequality among men has been consistently higher than that for women. The fact that the red and blue lines are roughly parallel shows that trends in inequality were similar over this time for men and women. Remember, this picture is based on the 90-10 ratio, and so considers a comparison of wages near the bottom to wages near the top of the income distribution. Next, let's look at the same time period, but focus on the 50-10 wage ratio rather than the 90-10 ratio. Some features of this gap, or ratio, are similar to that based on the previous measure. For example, inequality among men is still consistently higher than among women, and both lines do show an upward trend over time. In other ways, however, these two figures are quite different. Note, for example, that the increase in inequality using the 50-10 ratio occurred mainly during the 1980s and then leveled off. The increase in inequality during the 1980s was not reversed in the years since 1990, but it also did not grow any further. Recall that in the case of the 90-10 ratio, there's been an almost continuous increase in inequality. This shows that the story of inequality at the very top of the wage distribution has continued, with less movement in inequality indicators over the past 15 years when we look at the middle and bottom of the U.S. income distribution. Next, let's think about our discussion of across versus within group inequality. This figure shows trends in an important measure of across group inequality, that between more and less educated individuals. Here, the measure used is the difference in median annual earnings for college-educated to median annual earnings of high school-only graduates. This measure is similar to the percentile gaps and ratios we discussed earlier, but based on observable education groups. The green line shows that the differences in median annual earnings among households in which the head has a college education relative to earnings by households headed by those with less education were growing from 1979 until about 2000. From 2000 to 2012, this gap, one measure of inequality, has not increased by as much. Finally, we want to look at what happened to within-group inequality, or inequality not related to observable characteristics. Recall that for this, we'll use an adjusted wage, or a wage residual. The next two graphs show how inequality evolved in the U.S. since the 1960s, controlling for or taking away the effects of education and experience. This again shows an almost continuous increase in the 90-10 wage ratio measures of inequality from 1970 through 2008. The increase slows, especially for women in the early 2000s, but does not stop. It slowed again after 2008 in the major recession, but then continued to slowly increase. The 50-10 ratio, now graphed for residual wage inequality, adjusting for education and experience, again shows a major increase occurring from 1980 through 1990 and then leveling off. Focusing on the lower half of the wage distribution, the 1980s were the key period of rising inequality not related to education or experience. In the past few modules, we've introduced some key measures of inequality, working with percentiles to form wage ratios or wage gaps, and introduced the summary measure of inequality known as the Gini coefficient. We've also discussed the differences in within and across group inequality. With this background on inequality measurement, we've now had a chance to summarize some key facts about inequality in the U.S. since 1970. This will provide the basis for our discussion in a future week of the potential causes of rising inequality in the U.S.